I'd like to introduce you guys to our guest here, Joshua Dyer, also known as, if you looked on the Amazon page, as J.E. Dyer. And I believe, if I remember from our conversation that we had, right, you use both of those as pen names for
Correct.
different genres, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
thank you very much for joining us, Joshua. I appreciate it. And for everybody else, Joshua is the author of 14 books and has numerous pieces published in other places too, like the Los Angeles Times, for example. And he's active duty in the Navy, but also has time or finds time to write books. So welcome. And like I said before, thank you for coming, Joshua. We appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, and thank you. Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you to your audience for, participating and being a part. Glad to be here.
Great. So we're here to talk mostly about your book Barons, because that's about the development of the Transcontinental Railroad from the Central Pacific side of things. But
Correct.
since you're an author of other stuff too, we may touch on some other parts of your work. I'm just really interested in just having a conversation with you as an author, and we'll go from there. So the first
Okay.
question I'd have is, if you wouldn't mind to sort of, if I left anything out of the introduction that you'd like people to know, start with that, and we'll go with a question afterwards.
Sure. No, no. I mean, yeah, you covered most of the big things. I write under J.E. Dyer for historical fiction and the general mainstream fiction stuff. So that way, someone that buys something under my given name that's horror or fantasy sci-fi doesn't get completely thrown off track and surprised by what their purchase was. So it's just easy to keep those two separated. Yep, still active duty in the Navy. Loving that. It's been kind of challenging here in the past few months, of course, along with everyone else. We're having our issues too. Yeah, I'm also married, a father of 3 kids, and love to bake. I love to bake, so I'll do anything from croissants to brownies to cupcakes to cakes, pies, tarts, you name it. Cooking and culinary stuff. I'm just a very creative person. So.
Yeah, well, I mean that shows, obviously, if you've written 14 books, you have to be creative to even write one book, I would think.
Well, yeah, even one project is a challenge. So yeah, hats off to anybody and everybody out there that's done that themselves. I can relate. It's a challenge.
Right. So that kind of brings me to the first question that I wanted to ask you about, which was, what motivated you to want to be an author in the first place?
I've always had a penchant, I guess, for telling stories, whether it was around a campfire or just like even my cousins and I, when we were growing up, we'd all go to grandma's house and stuff, or one of the others' houses, and we'd tell each other stories and come up with these great, fantastic adventures of different things to keep ourselves occupied, because that was back in the era of, Atari and no computers, none of the fancy stuff we have, bells and whistles we have now. And so, that was a lot of it. It rooted from that and my love of books of all sorts. And I just had a passion for creating things and sharing information and inspiring and instilling emotion in other people. And that's where it came from. Yeah.
That's interesting. Who would you say are your biggest influences in your writing?
Early on, I read a ton of Margaret Weiss, Tracy Hickman, which were fantasy authors for like the Dragonlance series and some other things like that. As a kid, that was just a huge part. And I went on to do like the classical stuff like Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, of course, and delve into some of the classical stuff, Alexander Pushkin and his short stories, and a lot of the Russian classic people, Tolstoy, Lermontov, were also influential. In high school, it was all Shakespeare, like everybody. I think these days you study a lot of Shakespeare, you study a lot of Robert Frost poems and things like that are really good, Henry David Thoreau. So yeah, you grow up on all those things, and I think it all kind of culminates together and shapes you. And it again, their emotional impact on me as a reader helped shape who I am as a writer too. And that's one thing I always like to say is, I read probably 100 times more than I write. For every single word I write, I'll probably read 100 words.
Right.
That's my ratio. Yeah.
So I'm curious then about the book Barons, since that's
Yeah.
really what we were to talk about here. And the synopsis actually is fairly involved. And I'm kind of curious about, there's a lot of, I'm trying to preface the question here. I think that there's a lot of known history there that you could have recounted as well, but you chose to do a historical fiction. And I'm kind of curious about your choice to do that. What made you want to do a
Yeah.
historical fiction instead of a straight historical recount?
Right. Yeah, and like you said, there is a plethora of information out there. I mean, even just going through the Central Pacific's historical museum website and stuff in their museum there, I gathered a lot of information. But for me, it was about the characters, about getting really close and an emotional connection and trying to revive who they were as people, rather than everything that we know about the facts of who they were, as like Ambrose and a bunch of other talented writers have done in nonfiction and in historical reference novels and books, and done with great success. But there aren't as many, I guess, historical fiction books that are written on the subject that touch into those people, those 5 families total that were the associates on the central side, and helped build that railroad and who they were and how they came from like dust to diamonds and their whole rags to riches story. And just to show people that they were human too. And that was missing in my opinion.
Right. Were there any sort of unusual discoveries or things like that in your research that you found that you were surprised by when you were figuring out who these people were and what they did?
Yeah, there were. Well, I mean, for the associates, they did a lot of interesting things from what I uncovered. So there were several instances, and we talked a little bit about it earlier, but where you'd have certain articles, and maybe historical societies and museums would have different pieces of information, and then there were missing gaps in between. Like an example would be, so Theodore Judah played a big role in this, and a lot of other historical fiction stories based on the first transcontinental didn't really play up Theodore's role as the innovator of the rail line like he should have been, I think, in my opinion at least. So I went back and tried to get really delve down into Theodore and his role in the whole thing and how he brought everybody on board for his dream, his vision. But in the grand scheme of it, he basically thought that all of his work and effort as the chief engineer earned him his place on the board with Central Pacific. And of course, the other 4 partners were like, no, if you want to buy your way in like we have, that's $100,000. We're more than happy to accommodate that. And of course, he said, I don't have that kind of money. That's ridiculous. So they in turn decided to buy him out at the same amount, $100,000, which of course was unfair because that was like 25 grand a piece for each of them. But they went ahead and did that, and that really ticked him off. So he decided he was going to go down through Panama and up to New York City to find Cornelius Vanderbilt and try and have him come around and buy Central Pacific out from under the associates. And the gap between leaving San Francisco, crossing Panama, and coming up in the Atlantic is kind of a gray area that there's not a lot said about, other than even in the historical timeline, like on the CPRR's historical museum said that he died of an illness en route to New York City on the other side of Panama. And so as a fiction writer, I kind of put those pieces together and said, okay, well, what if hypothetically Huntington hired somebody to poison him with rattlesnake poison, which mimics yellow fever, which Theodore Judah allegedly died of on his way to New York City, as a means of knocking him out of the picture before he got a chance to get to Cornelius Vanderbilt and have a hostile takeover, in Huntington's opinion. Which, from what I've gathered from Huntington, being a born salesman and a really strong backbone type of end of personality, that would not entirely be outside of his character to do something if he was forced into a corner to do something that extreme. So that's just an example of the facts and the fiction kind of merging together in the same melting pot for the story.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on it too, because it's totally plausible, right? I mean, it could easily be. Yeah, it could easily be what happened. Whether it is, we'll never know. But it does make for some drama, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's the big thing, is with historical fiction, you bring up a great point. It's about making it a palatable piece of entertainment, I guess. It's also got some historic merit to it, of course, but making it palatable to the wider audience, for even whether it's novels or if it's a film or a TV series or a stream series these days. But it's just opening it up, that emotion, that drama, for the audience to enjoy. And that's like we talked about. That's one of the big things for me, is bringing back the steam line, that era of steam trains, and just an appreciation for it that I think has been vastly lost by our culture over the past several decades. And
we talked.
I'm
sorry. We talked about that a little bit on our sort of pre-interview on Wednesday about the historical relevance or the critical nature of the influence of trains and railroads on the development of really not only this country, but really of the industrialized world when you think about it. And I do think that anything that brings that idea to light, whether it's historical fiction or nonfiction or whatever, is definitely a worthwhile endeavor. So I thank you for having the insight to think about that when you decided to write the book in the first place, because I think it's important.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there were also dozens of men immigrants, like Chinese Americans, as well as Americans from all over Europe, Ireland, Scotland, that died building this first transcontinental for different reasons, like frostbite, freezing in the mountains, digging through the tunnels. There was one point where one of the engines came off the rails that had iced over in a storm coming downhill, and went through killing 8 different Chinese American immigrants that were working on the line at the time. Just basically went right through them. So you don't hear about those kind of things, I guess, and the sacrifice that those people put into building what we have almost taken for granted these days.
Yeah, I think I agree with your assessment there too. So I'm curious about when you do a historical fiction, and it might be different for different authors. So this probably is mostly just for you. I mean, you can't talk for somebody else, right? But how much, is there a ratio? Like, do you try to make it, 80% historical documented fact and 20% fiction, or like, is there a process or a litmus test, for what you're going to include and what you're not? Like, when you go back and read it, you're like, oh, I made too much stuff up, that kind of thing, or is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I try to keep it, a good 80-20 mix is about where I like to keep it on historical fiction specifically. So I'll do all the research, and like I said, you'll have big chunks of it that everybody knows about, that's written down and has been documented, and then there's these little gray areas where the fiction has to come in, and I use that to bridge the gap between the different pieces of fact that I've found and researched, and try and see. I might play for like hours, maybe even days, with hypothetical scenarios, which is what I did with that Theodore Judah example, saying, well, could Huntington have done this? Would it be something within his scope of personality based on what we historically know about him? Or is it too far exaggerated? What length would he go to keep his multi-million-dollar empire from being bought out from under him? Those kinds of things. So, I mean, I get a little bit of artistic license being fiction, that I can kind of play with that a little bit, where Ambrose and the others may not necessarily. But again, I try to use that as the litmus test of, is it plausible? Is it realistic? And not some outlandish, crazy thing that could have possibly never happened.
Do you find that a challenge, though? Because plausibility is kind of a subjective judgment when you think about it. What you think is plausible, I might disagree. So how do you temper that when you're coming up with the storylines?
Yeah, so when I'm coming up with storylines, I'll bounce it off a couple other people. I belong to different historical fiction groups and things, that's historical societies, and I'll say, hey, I'm doing an ABC here, and kind of say, what do you think seems plausible given this little chunk of information and what you know about these people? And if you don't know anything, then I'll backfill a little bit further to give you the details to see if you can come up with it and see what sounds semi-realistic. Because, like you say, it's definitely a subjective topic when you start talking about hypotheticals.
Do you ever find yourself worried that you might upset an heir or a descendant of someone? Because, maybe someone who was part of the family was like, hey, that was my great grandfather, man. Why are you talking like this about him? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, all the time. I still do. Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things, again, when you're doing any kind of project like this, I try to weigh the good and the bad. And that was one of the curious things about Huntington in particular that I wanted to do, was that, like all these reporters in New York City had made them out to be the robber barons, like they were just pickpocketing and fleecing America all the time, and that's all they were interested in was money at any cost. They want to kill whoever they needed to get to the bottom dollar, and that just wasn't the truth. And so that particularly drew me to Huntington, because he was one of the ones that was the last living survivor of the Associates. So I took that information and said, okay, well, what if we put this reporter in the same room in Huntington's mansion with him? And they did a one-on-one interview, and Huntington said, here is the final record. I'm going to set it straight once and for all before I die, so that we weren't these ruthless, barren people that you made us out to be in your journalistic regurgitation, that sort of thing.
So I'm also curious, we do have some questions that are coming in on the chat window here, but I have one that I wanted to ask you before we get to that, which was, were you able to, remember we were talking about the Chinese workers and the Scottish workers and the Irish workers, were you able to incorporate any of those or any aspect of that part of the real story into your story in the book?
Yeah. So the CPR Museum had some interesting parts on both the Central Pacific side and the Union Pacific side, the immigrant workers that I was able to integrate into it. I had to come up with the different names and stuff and do some research into Chinese history and lineages during that time period, which was a whole other tangent that took a while. Hopefully it paid off. But yeah, thankfully the Central Pacific Museum had a lot of great documentation on these people and their ancestors. So I was able to integrate that into a couple of different chapters, basically from the Chinese workers' point of view, saying, hey, we're out here, we're hammering at maybe 2 inches an hour if we're lucky with pickaxes. This one guy comes up to Charles Crocker and he's like, hey, my hand's black and blue, it's frostbitten, I can't work anymore, I need to get to a fire. We're starving and stuff. And he said, no, we've got to meet a deadline. I need you to build the line over that mountain and down the other side before sunrise. And that's just, again, that's kind of, I got that opportunity to show the emotion and the character from both sides. Not only the deadlines that Crocker was trying to meet for President Lincoln and having the whole project done in that 12-year time window, but also from the Chinese workers' side saying, hey, we're basically trying to do the impossible for you here, and we cut us a little bit of slack. So it was an interesting dichotomy. Yeah.
And then there's the 10 miles in a single day story as well.
And that was awesome to not only discover, but to bring to life. That was an awesome scene to try and paint. I had to rewrite it probably 6 or 7 different times until I was finally satisfied with what I hopefully captured. But yeah, they were elated because the Union Pacific had done 9 miles, and it was covered in like all the Iowa, Nebraska, Washington D.C. papers, New York. Everybody was saying, "Wow, this is amazing." And Strobridge, Stro was like, "No, we can do better than that." So we can wait. What we'll do is we'll wait until we're coming close to Promontory. We'll take that last 10 miles, and we'll pound like hell. We'll get it done, and leave them with no way of ever topping it because they'll be too close. So he played a chess match against Granville Dodge on that last few weeks of work. And he waited till there was no track left, but just enough to beat the record and leave them with no gap. And he did it, but he had to really, really push them all the way up until almost sunset to hit the deadline. So right. It was fun. It was awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Little one-upmanship going there, which I'm sure was common. Right, commonplace with very competitive people like that. So,
Oh yeah, yeah, especially you had Grenville was a colonel, and Wells Stroh was, I think, also in the Army too. So yeah, they knew competition absolutely.
so I'm curious, and this actually feeds into a question that I had about your methodology, and it's a
Okay.
question from Joey here on the screen here. And he's
Yeah.
interested in how much research you perform using the internet versus traditional means like libraries, bookstores, museums, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good question, Joey. Thanks for that. So it was difficult because a lot of the stuff happened out west, and I'm in West Virginia. So I would say, yeah, probably closer to 65% was done via internet, doing like historical societies, like the museums. Like we discussed, I found some YouTube tours of like the old Huntington and Hopkins hardware store that they turned into a museum, and the Union Pacific Railroad Museum and other places like that. Thankfully, in today's technology, those things exist. But also, I checked out some libraries and things like that, and I've also got a personal collection of like New York Times through the Civil War and Civil War era encyclopedias and stuff that I can also sort of back reference and backfill things with. But yeah, because of the geographic distance and difference, it was a lot more online for this project than it was in person. Mm-hmm.
Were you able to get out to Sacramento and see that museum that you talked about? And did you go to Utah to Promontory to see the places that you were writing about as well?
I wish I could go there in person. Yeah, I did a lot of just anything I could find from the internet in terms of like what they look like. Again, as much real life virtual interaction as I could find. Unfortunately, the closest I've come is spending some time in Monterey, California, and going up to San Francisco and some of those places. But oh man, yeah, I would love to see some of these places in person one of these days, especially after this is all over. But yeah, I'd love to see it for myself rather than just watching videos and the historical recreations of Promontory, for example. Because it looks fun, but I'd love to see it in person.
As someone who's been to Promontory, it's definitely worth a trip out there if you can get there. Something that
Yeah,
is something that I find interesting in going to a place like that is to just stop and be still and listen and smell and just look and see. I mean, some places you can almost soak in history. It's kind of a
yeah.
kind of a kind of an abstract idea here, but I've experienced it and it's kind of cool. This message is coming to us from one of the Daves in the conversation here, and he's wondering, with so many correct historical facts, do you ever worry that readers will confuse the fact from the fiction when they're thinking about what happened? Do you know what I mean? Like, so if someone read your book and they're talking to their friends later, that they might say, "Oh, did you know that Huntington actually poisoned Judah with rattlesnake?" Do you know what I mean? Like, do you ever worry
Yeah,
about
that's a good
stuff like that?
question. Yeah, good question, Dave. Not entirely because I obviously make a point in the books and stuff to say, hey, this is historical fiction, with emphasis on the fiction part. We try to keep it. I try to keep it as close to historically accurate as I can, but there definitely are elements of fiction in it, so you can't take it as historical like textbook fact. There is that entertainment and emotional element of it that it'll always exist. So yeah. But yeah, I always have a little concern that there'll be somebody in a school somewhere saying, "Hey, I read somewhere that that he was poisoned." Yeah, it's like no. Let's not let's not get too far down the weeds. This is not the gospel we're talking about. It's just entertainment.
Unfortunately, like I said to you on Wednesday, I wasn't able to get the book in time for this, but I am
Mhm.
curious if you list your resources or like kind of a bibliography type deal in your
Yeah.
book. Did you, so people can look to see where you got your information and that
So,
kind of thing?
no, I didn't list the bibliography in the book, but if you like, I do have a list of resources that I did use for anybody that's interested. So yeah, like I said, I went through Central Pacific Railroad Historical Museum. They have a wonderful site. The University of California Museum and the California Historical Society also had some interesting stuff and helped me out. The Union Pacific Railroad Museum had a bunch of different things. The Huntington and Hopkins hardware store and their associates that were pretty helpful. And let's see, I also did some digging into the even New York City census for like Collis Huntington in particular, when he had his mansions there from 1870, 1880, 1890, and got detailed lists of all the employees, their lineage from like Ireland or Scotland or England or wherever they were from, and all that kind of stuff. And that was really cool. Let's see what else. Yeah, just like the local libraries, Martinsburg Public Library, and some things like that. That also helped out in some of their accesses. And see what else was there? The Adirondack Museum for Thomas Durant, the UPR side, Iowa and Nebraska historical societies had some help and a good hand in it as well.
Okay. I should mention that you have a Facebook presence. Do you want to share that with people? And if you have any other kind of a website or online presence, I think it would be worth sharing here so that people can learn more.
Oh, sure. So, yeah, if you just look me up on Facebook as Joshua Dyer Author, you'll find me in my smiling ugly mug, and you'll notice me. And yeah, I mean, I have Drum Jedi 76 is my Twitter handle if you wanted to do anything on Twitter. If you're into the darker side and psyche of humanity and want to delve into my horror stuff, I have Slave to Darkness, which is a Patreon page dedicated to dark fantasy and horror. So yeah, there's several different avenues to find me out there.
I find it interesting to be creative in so many different genres, because a lot of authors will just pick something that they are interested in or know about or whatever, and they kind of specialize in that. Do you ever find it challenging? Like, it seems to me like it would be hard to decide, I feel like writing a horror story today, and I don't know, is there a creative block that happens where you have to kind of kick yourself in the butt, or do you take a break from one book to finish another one? Or
so yeah, that's an interesting question. Not really a block. I have a whole pre-production process, and I come up with ideas, and I might kick the idea around for like weeks or months. And if it keeps percolating and coming back to my imagination, then I know it's a keeper. And if I don't think about it and write it, it's not worth writing down, then I'll just let that one go. But yeah, like it. So I finished Barrens back over the fall of 2019 and went through a lot of editing and revision processes, of course. But after that was done, I switched gears entirely and went into a horror series. And so doing that, yeah, I had to give myself maybe a week in between to kind of switch gears and get myself back into like okay, now I've got to murder people in my imagination, as opposed to like doing this, more of like a Tolstoy, Pushkin, very elegant and elaborate historical fiction piece that's very literary and going into this like very main genre specific dark path sort of thing. So yeah, that part's challenging for me to switch gears in my imagination and keep myself, I guess, in that particular mood to write that stuff.
Okay, someone else is asking a question in our chat window here, which is, when you get an idea, but maybe it's not something that you really want to write about, do you share that with other authors that to see if they want to take it someplace?
Sure. I mean, if it's something that I've jotted down and I kind of double back to it and it's like, I don't know if that one's going to work for me, I'll put it out as maybe on like one of the writing or author forums as like a story. I can't remember what they call them, like a writing prompt, and see if they want to run with it and say, hey, here's an idea. If you want to run with it, because I'm not going to really mess with it. So yeah.
I thought that was kind of an interesting question. It's like, because there's a lot of people that are worried about trade secrets and that kind of thing. Maybe you want to hold on to it for some other time in a couple of years when you do want to write about it or something like that.
True. Yeah, I mean, if I know for sure that it's not my cup of tea, I'm more than happy to share. Yeah, I mean, there's so much material out there that I always say there's room for everybody and every type of piece of material. It's just a matter of who wants to take it on and bring it to life.
Sure. Now, going back to Barrens, I thought of a question that I wanted to ask, but I forgot to write it down, which was, so when you got the idea that you wanted to write that particular book, from that moment of, I guess, concept to completion, how long did that take? And are most of your books along the same timeline or similar time commitment?
Okay, good question. So to answer the first part, with historical fiction, in particular this one, because it was so deep and there had been so many nonfiction books written about it, it probably took me a solid 6 months of just doing research. So when I did all that research, then I doubled back and I probably jotted down everything into like 3 different timelines. One for like the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific timelines of how they accomplished things, but then like a personal timeline of all these events that happened, like when Leland Jr. was born, when these guys got married, when Collis Huntington had the affair with Annabelle Yarrington, when Theodore Judah was allegedly, I say allegedly murdered, but he became ill with yellow fever, and all those different things, and then I'll sit them side by side and pair them up and say, okay, how can I bring all these elements together and start making the final story outline for the novel, and then from there, I start actually sitting down and typing up the first draft. And that whole process took me 17 months from start to finish for Barron's. And to answer the second question, my other more genre specific stuff like horror, sci-fi, fantasy are not as in-depth because it's more creation rather than research. So I can probably crank out a decent novel in one of those within 3 to 4 months in comparison.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense because the research aspect of a historical fiction has got to be, especially if it's stuff that's well documented, like the Transcon.
Oh yeah, there's a mountain, a literal mountain of information out there about these guys, which is great. But yeah, it took some sifting to boil it down to what I wanted to convey, like which part of that history I wanted to focus on the most. Mm-hmm.
Do you find that by not, because you said that you weren't able to get out to the places, how do you determine like how to describe, like the plains of Utah when they were coming on the final stretch to Promontory? Like how do you internalize that yourself in a way that you can then project it so that people can get the feeling of the mood of the scene that you're setting up?
I started off by trying to find anything in real life of people that had visited these places or hiked through the Sierra Nevadas. There is an uncanny amount of not simulated, but virtual hiking trips that people do on all these different trails and all these different places that you can find on YouTube or anywhere. And so I did a lot of that, and I did a lot of Google World, Google Earth, and a lot of research and everybody's stuff that they had, whether it was like with a state park or a official national area, and used a lot of that too, just to get a feel for what some of these places were. And then, yeah, like you said, it took a lot of time to try and capture that with just images only, rather than getting a lot of the other senses involved, which was challenging because that's something I really like to do, is try to involve all 5 senses, and that was a real challenge in this part because I could only use maybe 2 or 3.
That does make sense. I could see how that could be a challenge, having to not having been someplace to have to try to describe it like that. So,
Yeah.
Right, another one of our participants here is asking in the chat window,
Sure.
If you ever use names of people in your I'm assuming he's talking about the other fictional pieces.
I don't tend to use real people in those works. If I do, I'll definitely ask them first, or somebody might even approach me and say, "Hey, can we sit down and create a character and maybe give them my first name or something and go that route?" And I'm like, "Sure, yeah, we can try and figure something out." But yeah, other than that, I won't put in a bully from grade school and intentionally kill them in a with a slasher scene or something. No.
Oh man, that could be brutal.
That's that Tommy kid from the 6th grade. Well, guess what, Tommy?
Yeah, that's great. So I guess then, sort of in general, is don't use real names. I mean, people know that fiction is made up, and always when you watch a work of fiction on TV, it always says that the characters in this program were not related to anybody in real life, and no inference was intended or made or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. All these characters are pure fiction and no likeness to anyone living or dead. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So now there's something that I'm kind of curious about, having not had a chance to see the book.
Okay.
Did you have to learn anything or much about actual railroad operations in order to create scenes along and on the railroad? I mean, you talked about the whole accident with the Chinese workers getting hit by the train and all that, but how much
Yeah.
research did you do on actual operations of trains?
I had to do quite a bit because I didn't know too much about the actual operations. I've always, like I said, I've always been a fan of the steamers in particular in that era. So I had a little bit of knowledge, about what generally went on, but to really get down into it, yeah, it took a lot of research and stuff. And even some of the folks out here on the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad, they still operate like coal tender run scenic railroads up to Frostburg and back and stuff. And so they had some interesting information about, their current day-to-day trends, which I then tried to translate back to, okay, well, how much would it have changed between now and then on a similar model like that? How much could I infer? How much could I kind of fictionally play with and keep it still feasible? So yeah, there was a lot of that. And with a lot of my historical books, even like when I write a Western story, I did probably 2 weeks worth of studying of the different components of a horse saddle before I felt comfortable enough to sit down and write like 2 or 3 scenes in a Western story about this dude riding a horse. So yeah, you learn a bunch from these processes.
And I think that also by doing that research, you're adding to the plausibility factor that we were talking about earlier, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I want to make sure that, at least personally, that anybody that picks it up is drawn into it and doesn't want to let go once they're in it. And they're like, okay, yeah, this is definitely, I'm sucked in. I'm in this world. I'm in this era. Take me wherever you want to lead me. So that's my ultimate goal.
Right. So another question about Barons: when
Mhm.
you started to, or thinking about writing that one, did you read other recent books on the Transcon, or did you just go straight into your own research so that you wouldn't be influenced by other authors?
So I went straight into it from the first draft, and then when I went back and did the rewrites and started redrafting things, yeah, I would look at Ambrose and some of the other works that were out there just to kind of see how they approached it and what angle they came from. And a lot of them, like I said, were more universal, or unfortunately a little more leaning toward the Union Pacific side of things, because Hello Mills was so popular here in recent history over the past 6 or so years, that I think that sort of triggered more of the UPR side of things. And that was great, and that helped me on one half of the story I was trying to tell. But I wanted to focus more on the Western side of things, even though there wasn't, I guess, physically as much of a length of track that they built, but what they had to endure and was far more than Dodge and those guys ever had to do on the flat plains of Nebraska.
You read about or hear about these brutal stories of digging the tunnels through the Sierras, going through solid granite at a rate of a quarter of an inch a day or something like that. And gas
Mm-hmm.
ex- gas explosions killing entire crews and just horrendous stuff like that.
Yeah,
But
I even had like my narrator for the audiobook version, Thomas Ashworth. It asked me. There was one point where one of the guys in the Union Pacific was trying to blast through a boulder to build the line because they couldn't move it, of course, and it was going to cost too much to go around. So they brought up a demolitions crew, and the guy accidentally blew half his arm off, and they were miles out in the middle of nowhere. So Dodge pulls out his pistol and shoots the guy dead right on the spot, and everybody got so angry at him and aggravated by that point, between that and him like brutally beating them and punishing them and stuff on the work site, that they just dropped their tools and walked off. And so yeah, Tom was like, when he was reading and narrating, he's like, did that really happen? Was that guy like that much of a jerk? I was like, yeah, I mean, these guys were going about things the best way they knew how. And back then it was definitely a totally different generation of, I guess, leadership style, for lack of a better word.
are you a bit of a rail fan yourself, or did writing the book turn you into a bit of a rail fan? I mean, I know you said you like trains generally, but
Yeah.
how deep does that illness go?
The illness. So yeah, I've always been kind of a rail fan ever since I was a kid and got the first Lionel set. I believe it was an old Southern green steam train set, real small, tiny little circular basic thing like most of us kids had. And that kind of fascinated me from there. And then, of course, here in West Virginia, we only had, back in the 80s, the Cass Scenic Railroad that went up into the Appalachians. And that just, seeing those kind of trains in person really just kind of captivated my imagination. So I guess I kind of came into it wanting to revive that passion for that era and the scenic railroads, and just, riding the rails for leisure like they used to. I mean, even today, like in Russia and the Trans-Siberian, you could pay, I guess it's the equivalent of about 14,000 American dollars to go for one full week from St. Petersburg and the European side all the way across to Vladivostok, across the entire Asian continent, and see all these different stops and do all these wonderful things for their package that includes. And we just, other than Amtrak, which is more of a business thing, I guess, we've kind of lost touch with that aspect of our culture. And so that definitely drove me toward this project and saying, hey, what can I do to show that raw emotion of these guys and their wives and their families that went into this, the sacrifice, the money, the emotion that built that whole first Transcon and the entire railing industry from there in the Civil War period forward. And so that's, I've become a little, I guess, more ill as a result of this whole project and this endeavor.
Right. Well, I mean, once you get into it, there's so much to learn. It's not hard to fall into the rabbit hole, as they say.
Right. Well, there was, even like on a previous project, I was watching interviews with a guy that was a hobo in the 50s and 60s, and he said it well, that once the rails bites you and it gets in your blood, it never leaves. It always stays there. So, yeah, I can see that.
I think a lot of the people in this window here probably understand exactly what he's talking about. So, right.
Yeah.
So I have another question, which
Absolutely.
has to do with your other works as well.
Okay.
But it's still related to Barron's in a way, because it has to do with the fact that, like, do you have trains as part of your other books? Like Murder on the Train or something like that.
So, for the stuff that I write in historical fiction and mainstream fiction, I try to work in the rails and everyone in each of those. For it's harder when you're doing other things, especially like sci-fi and fantasy. I've still managed to do it in a couple to try and work in, the rails, but absolutely, like Finding November was all about I got a kid that was broken up from his family during the Great Depression, and he rode the rails as a hobo in the 30s and then just disappeared, and they never knew if he lived or died. So that was definitely a big part of that story. And of course, Barron's is nothing but the rails. And even like a sci-fi story that I've been working on that's like way out there, kind of sci-fi fantasy, I've integrated like virtual rails that run up the side of these massive skyscrapers and levitating anti-gravity trains, things like that. Yeah, I try to work in all these different angles and creative aspects of the rails somehow into my stories.
I think we talked about Finding November, which is another book that Josh wrote, by the way, guys, in case you want to take a look at it. I think we talked about that one on Wednesday when we did our little pre-talk. So it did sound like an interesting story.
So November is the name of the person, November Green, and he was the kid that was forcibly split up from his other siblings and rode the rails during the Great Depression. And as interesting as it would be, he basically built a model train shop up in Redding, California, called November's Collectibles at the end of the story.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you have any plans for any other? I mean, if you don't want to talk about what books you have in the works, you don't have to. But do you have any railroad? Sure. Yeah, do you have any railroad related books in the works right now, or thoughts of doing anything like that?
Yes, I'm kicking around, taking a stab at doing one from the Vanderbilt family side of things here back in the East, and taking it from their head butler, I can't remember her name right off the top of my head, but taking it from her perspective and how she saw Cornelius and his son build up everything and build the Biltmore estate for his wife and everything, and build their empire, railroad empire, from like New York all the way down into the southeast, and see how they played things. So yeah, I'm kind of tinkering with that one, but again, it's a lengthy process of research. And thankfully, since it's here on the East Coast, I've been to the Biltmore estate like multiple times and seen it in person, and so I'm very familiar with the Vanderbilt family, and I've got that working for me at least a little bit on this one.
How many books would you have in process at a single time? Do you tend to just focus on one and get it done and then move on to the next?
Good question. And no. So right now I've probably got 4 different novels in the works. And so so like I said, I'll have this little pre-production process where I'll do any research I need to do, and I'll sit down and I'll outline all the characters, flesh them out from end to end, outline the entire story at least in part, so that I don't have writer's block. I found that works best for me, at least personally. And then type up the drafts and stuff. And so when I get stuck and I'm coming up with like a question in one manuscript and saying, I could take it this way or I could take it that way, I'll back off and think about it for a little bit and just jump over to the next one and work on it for a little bit. And so for at least, for me, that process works. It's challenging, but it definitely works.
Do you find that bouncing the ideas like off of your family or something like that, you get some useful feedback to get a direction?
Yeah, absolutely. And even on my Facebook page in particular, I'll ask people there. I'll throw out a little excerpt or an idea and say, hey, how do you guys feel about this particular thing?
I find when I'm working on a project that you get wrapped up into it, and it's hard to step back and go outside yourself to see what it really looks like to somebody else. And
Exactly.
Right. Being able to get feedback from someone who is outside, I find to be really helpful to me. So I would imagine it's probably a similar process, huh?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, me too. Yeah, I have several different other, I guess, beta testing groups for when I get a manuscript to a point where it's polished enough to have someone else read it and critique it and stuff. Yeah, that's invaluable feedback for me.
Joey on the computer screen here is asking if you ever create polls on which character, like what a character should do to another. I'm trying to read this. Does that sound right, Joey? Am I doing this right? Do you ever create polls on what one character should do to another character? Oh, I see. And then go with and then go with the popular opinion, or do you just make the executive decision yourself?
So yeah, for most of my stuff, I've done some what we call campfire stories, where I'll throw out like a few paragraphs of an introduction story, and I'll say, okay, in the group, what do you want to happen next? And so I've experimented with those, and those were fun. Like, the campfire story methods are pretty fun. But for my actual books and stuff, I usually tend to make the executive decisions on that one. I might throw out a poll of like, hey, which scenario do you like, or if this were a dark fantasy idea, or if this were a historical fiction idea, would it be entertaining, or which direction would you like to see it go? But yeah, I'll definitely retain the final decision on some of those.
Right. That makes sense, right? You're putting your name on it after all, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So Dave is asking, have you ever written a book so fast that the ideas just flow from your mind, from start to finish, and then at the end, you had so much more that you wanted to fit into the story but couldn't? Has that ever happened to you?
Close. So one of the horror stories I wrote, Restless, I started to do my process and write down all the notes and tried to flesh out all the characters, but it got so into it that when I first started the draft of it, it went within like 3 days, and I finished like 60 something chapters in the whole thing in 3 days straight. And then I went back and I was like, well, crap. I mean, I had these other ideas that that just now either I would have to rewrite entire chunks, or it just wouldn't make sense. So I tried to leave those leftovers for the follow-on stuff to see if I could squeeze those in. But yeah, that's only happened once so far, and that was a really energetic experience. I enjoyed that thoroughly. I didn't get a whole lot of sleep, but yeah, I enjoyed it.
How fast was the fastest book you completed?
That one was it, and that one, I think I got that finished in about 3.5 weeks from end to end.
Right? Isn't that something, going from a 3.5 weeks to a 17-month?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
like, yeah, why can't I do this with any other project?
Right. Yeah, that's a pretty big difference. But I mean, it makes sense though, because when you're going to do a lot of research, because if you're going to do a historical fiction, even though you're making up those little storylines, you have to get the historical part right, or else it won't have any credibility with some people. So
exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean. I had to compare at least 3 timelines for historical at any one time to see how to integrate all the different facets of what was going on to make it, realistic enough.
Okay, then, Joshua, I want to thank you for joining us. Really appreciate your insight and sharing your methods and your experience with us. It's greatly appreciated. And when I stop the recording here, we can hang out and talk a little bit. But until next time, thank you much for joining us and sharing your story. And the name of the book that we've been talking about is Barons, and you can find it on Amazon and other places. If you're watching this video on YouTube, I've included a link to the book on Amazon in the description of the video. So you can just click on that if you're interested in reading it. So thank you much, Joshua, for joining us.
Thank you for having me very much. It was a pleasure.